Most people think the final girl is simply the last person standing. You know, the one who makes it to the end credits while everyone else winds up dead. The one who probably has some very awkward explanations to give the police regarding the pile of bodies left behind. But over the years, the final girl has evolved into something much bigger than that. She has become one of horror's most important cultural icons. For over 50 years, the final girl has reflected what each generation believes survival required. In the 1970s, survival meant endurance, a decade shaped by Vietnam, Watergate, economic uncertainty, and a growing distrust of government institutions. Simply making it out alive was enough. The 1980s meant self-reliance. This was the era of latchkey children, which was apparently society's way of saying, good luck, we'll be home around 6. In the 1990s, survival meant awareness. The media was everywhere, information was constant, and the feeling that the stories people told matter more than the facts themselves was becoming increasingly common. In the 2000s, resilience in the face of trauma of 9/11 became the defining challenge, as horror grappled with grief, loss, and psychological survival. And today, survival often means holding on to your identity in a world that seems determined to redefine who you are, where you belong, and what you're supposed to become. The monsters and settings might have changed, but the fears have always stayed the same. The exception is that of the final girl, who survived but has evolved. Welcome back to Politics of Fear, the channel where we do the unthinkable. We treat horror movies like the cultural artifacts they actually are. Because horror films don't just scare audiences, they reveal the fears the culture is trying very hard not to confront. Today we're looking at the 10 most important final girls in horror history, following their evolution from the 1970s to the present. These are the women who defined an era, and ultimately tells us something about the fears of the world that created them. Now, before the comments section starts sharpening its knives, this list is based on my interpretation of their historical and cultural significance. If you think I missed someone, or if you'd like to see another list featuring final girls who were just as important, let me know in the comments below. Horror fans have never disagreed about anything before, so I'm sure this will go smoothly. So let's begin where all great horror stories do, with survival. Number 10. Sally Hardesty, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974. The modern final girl begins with Sally Hardesty. Unlike many of the characters who would follow her, Sally doesn't defeat the monster, overcome her fears, or deliver a triumphant final confrontation. She survives by the skin of her teeth. By the end of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, she is bloodied, traumatized, and laughing hysterically as she escapes Leatherface in the back of a truck. That image perfectly captures the anxieties of the 1970s. America had watched Vietnam drag on, witnessed Watergate, exposed political corruption, and experienced economic uncertainty at home and at the gas stations. Trust in political institutions was eroding, and the world no longer felt stable or predictable. In that environment, horror became less interested in heroes defeating monsters and more interested in ordinary people surviving in a world that no longer made sense. Sally reflects that same doubt Americans were having. She doesn't win because she is stronger than the horror around her. She wins because she manages to accidentally survive. And for a generation increasingly convinced that there were no easy answers, sometimes survival was victory enough. Number 9. Lorie Strode, Halloween, 1978. If Sally created the final girl, Lorie Strode refined her. Lorie represents a growing cultural fear that danger could exist within ordinary suburban life. Michael Myers doesn't emerge from an ancient castle, a distant wilderness, or some forgotten corner of the world. He appears in a quiet neighborhood, filled with well-kept lawns, friendly neighbors, and the promise of safety. During the late 1970s, Americans were increasingly confronting the reality that danger did not always come from outside society. Rising crime rates, sensational media coverage, economic uncertainty, and growing social tensions contributed to a sense that familiar spaces might not be as secure as possible as people once believed. This was especially significant because the suburbs had long been promoted as places of safety, stability, and prosperity, a refuge from the perceived problems of urban life. Yet that vision was never equally accessible to everyone. Housing practices such as redlining and other forms of discrimination helped shape who could live in many suburban communities, reinforcing the idea that suburbia represented security and order. By the late 1970s, however, that sense of protection was beginning to erode. Films like Halloween challenged the belief that danger only existed somewhere else. Michael Myers does not invade Haddonfield from another world. He walks through its quiet streets as if he belongs there. In doing so, Halloween transformed the suburb from a symbol of safety into a source of fear, asking whether these supposedly secure communities were ever as protected as people believed. Lorie survives because she remains alert in a world that increasingly ignores warning signs, while the adults around her are absent or unaware. Her importance extends beyond the film itself. She becomes the template for decades of female horror characters to follow. Through Lorie, horror began asking a new question. What happens when the place where you are supposed to feel safest becomes the source of fear itself? Number 8. Nancy Thompson. Nightmare on Elm Street, 1984. Nancy Thompson reflects a very different anxiety. Unlike Lorie, Nancy is surrounded by adults who either ignore her or dismiss her concerns entirely. Parents and teachers regularly fail her. The authorities offer no meaningful help, and she is ultimately forced to confront Freddy Krueger alone. Released during the Reagan era, A Nightmare on Elm Street arrived at a time when American culture increasingly emphasized independence, personal responsibility, and the belief that individuals were accountable for solving their own problems. At the same time, many horror films reflected a growing fear that authority figures were either unable or unwilling to keep people safe. Nancy experiences that firsthand. The adults around her are distracted, dismissive, or hiding uncomfortable truths about the past, leaving her to solve a problem she never created. Even Freddy himself exists because the previous generation tried to solve a problem through violence and secrecy, rather than confronting it openly. As a result, Nancy inherits a crisis she did not create. If Freddy is going to be stopped, Nancy has to do it herself. She survives not because she is lucky, but because she studies the threat, develops a strategy, and acts. While the adults drink, deny, and avoid responsibility, Nancy becomes the only person willing to confront reality. In many ways, she reflects a generation learning that survival depended less on government-backed institutions and more on individual action. Through Nancy, the final girl evolved from someone who merely survived horror into someone who actively fought back against it. Number 7. Ellen Ripley, Alien or Aliens. Few final girls as influential as Ellen Ripley. While the xenomorph is one of horror's greatest monsters, Ripley's true struggle is against something even larger, corporate power. Throughout Alien, the Weyland-Yutani Corporation repeatedly places profit above human life, treating the crew as disposable assets. That fear resonated strongly with audiences in the late 1970s and throughout the 1980s, a period when large corporations were becoming increasingly powerful and influential in everyday life. As globalization expanded and major companies grew, many people worried that institutions were becoming too large and willing to sacrifice ordinary workers in pursuit of profit. Alien taps directly into that anxiety. The crew of the Nostromo are not explorers or heroes. They are workers, basically truck drivers in space. And when the corporation discovers something valuable, their lives immediately become secondary to the potential payoff. Ripley is the only one willing to challenge that logic. She recognizes the danger long before everyone else and refuses to accept the idea that human beings should be treated as expendable. This makes her distinctly different from earlier final girls. Sally endured, Lorie survived, Nancy fought back. Ripley takes command. In many ways, she reflects a growing cultural fear that the people running the system were not necessarily acting in the public's best interests. By standing against both the xenomorph and the corporation that enabled it, Ripley transformed the final girl from a survivor into a force capable of confronting power itself. Number 6. Clarice Starling, The Silence of the Lambs, 1991. Clarice Starling enters a world dominated by men and institutions that constantly underestimate her. Throughout The Silence of the Lambs, she navigates law enforcement agencies, bureaucracies, and professional spaces that often treat her as an outsider. The serial killers may be the immediate threat, but the environment itself is frequently hostile. Released in 1991, the film arrived during a period when more women were entering careers traditionally dominated by men, particularly in fields such as law enforcement, government, and the military. While opportunities were expanding, women often faced skepticism, exclusion, and the constant pressure to prove they belonged. Clarice experiences that reality throughout the film. She is frequently the only woman in the room, subjected to dismissive attitudes, unwanted attention, and assumptions about her abilities. What makes Clarice important is that her success does not come from physical strength or sheer survival. She succeeds because she is intelligent, determined, and observant. While many of the men around her overlook details or allow their egos to guide them, Clarice listens, analyzes, and adapts. In many ways, she reflects a cultural shift taking place at the end of the 20th century. The final girl was no longer simply surviving danger. She was proving she belonged in spaces that had long excluded her. By confronting both the violence of individuals like Buffalo Bill and the institutional barriers surrounding her, Clarice helped redefine what strength looked like in horror. She survives not because she outmuscles her opponents, but because she outthinks them. Number 5. Sidney Prescott, Scream, 1996. By the 1990s, horror had become self-aware, and Sidney Prescott became the perfect final girl for a media-saturated generation. Unlike earlier survivors, Sidney knows the rules, as does the audience and even the killers. This creates a world where information is everywhere, but certainty is nowhere. Released in 1996, Scream arrived during a decade defined by cable television, 24-hour news cycles, tabloid culture, and increasing public fascination with crime and violence. High-profile events like the O.J. Simpson trial had turned real-life tragedy into a form of mass entertainment. While television and movies were becoming increasingly reflective, audiences were no longer passive consumers of stories, but they now understood the formulas and recognized the tropes. Wes Craven's Scream embraced that reality and built an entire horror film around it. The fear was no longer ignorance, but manipulation. Sidney now lives in a world where everyone understands the narrative, yet people continue to be controlled by it. The killers are motivated by movies. The media turns tragedy into spectacle. Even Sidney's personal trauma becomes something others attempt to exploit for attention and profit. In many ways, she represents a generation raised on television, movies, and mass media who understood how stories were constructed, but still struggled to control the stories being told about them. Her survival depends on recognizing those narratives and refusing to play the role others have written for her. She was surviving a culture increasingly obsessed with turning everything, including violence, into entertainment. Number 4. Sarah Carter, The Descent, 2005. Sarah Carter represents a very different kind of final girl. In Neil Marshall's The Descent, Sarah joins a group of friends on a spelunking expedition deep inside an uncharted cave system. What begins as an adventurous getaway quickly turns into a nightmare when the group becomes trapped underground and discovers they are not alone. As supplies run low, tensions rise, and pale humanoid creatures begin hunting them through the darkness, the cave itself becomes just as dangerous as the monsters living within it. By the time The Descent was released, horror had entered a much darker era. The optimism of the 1990s had been shaken by events such as 9/11, the war on terror, and a growing sense that catastrophe could arrive without warning. Horror films became more brutal, more claustrophobic, and more interested in psychological suffering than simple survival. Unlike many final girls before her, Sarah enters the story already carrying trauma. Following the deaths of her husband and daughter, she is emotionally fractured long before she enters the cave. The underground labyrinth becomes more than just a setting. It becomes a reflection of grief itself, dark, disorienting, isolating, and seemingly endless. As the group falls apart and the creatures close in, Sarah is forced to confront both external monsters and her own emotional wounds. What makes her important is that she survives not because she remains untouched by tragedy, but because she endures it. In many ways, Sarah reflects the fears of the early 2000s, a period when horror became less concerned with defeating evil and more concerned with surviving trauma. She was no longer simply escaping a killer. She was learning how to live with loss. Number 3. Dany Ardor, Midsummer, 2019. Dany Ardor may be the most controversial final girl on this list because her victory feels deeply unsettling. In Ari Aster's Midsummer, Dany begins the film devastated by a family tragedy that leaves her emotionally adrift and increasingly dependent on a boyfriend who is unable or unwilling to support her. In search of escape, she joins a group of friends on a trip to a remote Swedish commune, only to discover that the community they have entered is part of a dangerous pagan cult. Yet what makes Midsummer so disturbing is that the cult provides something Dany genuinely lacks: attention, empathy, and a sense of belonging. Released at the end of a decade increasingly defined by social media, political polarization, mental health discussions, and growing concerns about loneliness, the film reflects anxieties surrounding isolation in the modern world. Despite being more connected than ever through technology, many people reported feeling increasingly disconnected from meaningful relationships and community. Dany represents that fear. The horror of Midsommar comes from the fact that her needs are legitimate, even if the solution is horrifying. She wants support, understanding, and to feel seen. The cult simply recognizes those needs before anyone else does. In many ways, Dany reflects a generation grappling with questions of identity, belonging, and emotional connection in an increasingly fragmented world. Her story asks a deeply uncomfortable question. How far would someone go to feel understood? Her survival comes at a terrible cost, but that cost is exactly what makes her one of the most important final girls in horror history. Dany was no longer simply escaping a monster, but searching for a place to belong, a community. In many ways, that reflects a modern anxiety shaped by loneliness and a growing search for connection in an increasingly digital world. Number 2, Tess Marshall, Barbarian, 2022. Tess Marshall represents a distinctly modern anxiety. In Barbarian, she arrives in Detroit for a job interview, only to discover that the Airbnb she rented has somehow been double booked. A stranger named Keith is already staying there. From the very first scene, the film places Tess in a situation many women immediately recognize. Can he be trusted? Is this a situation safe? Am I overreacting, or am I ignoring a warning sign? Released during a period shaped by online interactions, true crime culture, conversations surrounding women's safety, and the lingering effects of the #MeToo movement, Barbarian reflects a world where vigilance has become routine. Tess reflects a generation raised on online reviews, true crime documentaries, and social media safety advice. The modern final girl doesn't just check into an Airbnb. She mentally conducts a background investigation before putting her suitcase down. For many people, especially women, modern life often involves a constant process of risk assessment. Trust your instincts, watch for red flags, stay alert, but also don't be too paranoid. Tess finds herself caught between those conflicting expectations. Tess is not the first final girl of color, nor does Barbarian represent the beginning of greater diversity in horror. What makes her significant is the specific anxieties she reflects. Tess embodies a modern fear rooted in risk assessment and the constant negotiation of safety in everyday life. What makes the film so effective is that it weaponizes that uncertainty. Long before the monster appears, Tess is already trying to determine who or what represents the real danger. Throughout the story, she remains aware of the warning signs around her. What allows her to survive is not blind luck, but her willingness to recognize danger when it appears, even when others dismiss her concerns. In many ways, Tess reflects a generation increasingly aware that danger is not always obvious, and that assurance can be difficult to find. Number 1, Naru, Prey, 2022. Naru represents a different kind of final girl. In Prey, she is a young Comanche woman determined to prove she is capable of becoming a hunter. Set in 1719 on the northern Great Plains, the film follows Naru as she struggles to earn respect within her community, while tracking a mysterious predator that turns out to be something far more dangerous than she ever imagined. What makes Naru important is not simply that she survives the predator, but learns from it. While stronger warriors rely on force, Naru relies on observation, adaptation, and knowledge. For much of Hollywood history, indigenous characters were often pushed to the margins of their own stories. Released in 2022, Prey arrived during a period when audiences were increasingly interested in recovering overlooked histories and hearing stories from perspectives that had long been excluded from major franchises. Prey is culturally significant because it reflects a broader shift in who gets to be the hero. By placing a Comanche woman at the center of a major horror franchise, the film challenged the decades of storytelling traditions while highlighting the value of knowledge and perspective. Naru's victory isn't built on physical dominance, it's built on her understanding her world better than anyone else. In many ways, Naru challenges a traditional horror assumption that survival belongs to the strongest person in the room. Instead, Prey suggests that survival often belongs to the person willing to learn, adapt, and see what others overlook. Survival was no longer simply about endurance or resilience, but perspective. Sometimes strength matters, but understanding your opponent, skills, and environment can matter even more. Final Girl has never simply been the last person alive. She reflects what each generation believes survival requires. The Final Girl evolves because our fears evolve. As society changes, horror changes with it. The monster may look different from decade to decade, but the question remains remarkably similar. What threatens us? What protects us? And what does it take to survive when the world no longer feels safe? That is why the final girl remains one of the most revealing figures in horror history. She is more than a survivor. She is a reflection of the culture that created her. So the next time you watch a horror movie, pay attention to the person who makes it to the end, because she is rarely just escaping a killer. She is confronting the anxieties of her decade. Whether it's Sally Hardesty enduring a world that no longer makes sense, Nancy Thompson learning that no one is coming to save her, Sidney Prescott navigating a media-saturated culture, Naru proving that perspective can be more powerful than brute strength, or Tess Marshall trying to navigate a world where uncertainty itself has become part of everyday life, each final girl tells us something about the fears her generation carried with it. Because in the end, horror isn't just about monsters, it's about survival. And the final girl has been showing us what that means for more than 50 years. Thanks for watching Politics of Fear, where horror movies aren't just scary, they're history screaming back at us. While opportunities were expanding, women often faced skepticism, exclusion, and the constant pressure to prove they helped. That didn't make sense. For much of Hollywood, history, while highlighting the value of knowledge,